Alright, so, how do we start?
Right.
Rights.
Okay.
We're both really jet lagged. Okay,
So, does anyone have an idea of what a right is in terms of debating in chat? So when people mention rights, what are they generally talking about?
The things you can do,
Things you can do?
allowed to do.
Things you're allowed to do, okay. Any examples?
Freedom of speech.
Okay, right to freedom of speech. What else? Any other examples of rights?
any others?
Suffrage.
Suffrage, sure, so voting. What else?
Movement, whatever.
Choice.
Okay. So that's one of the problems, right? Because people in debate often claim that people have rights to things, and they claim that they have a right to almost anything. What's a bit more complex is firstly establishing whether or not that right exists, and also explaining how it works in the context of the debate itself. So often people will claim that there are people or a group of actors have a right to a thing. Often they don't substantiate. So that's one of the biggest things you need to do with right debate. So that's what we're going to try and look at today.
So, ultimately rights aren't just a thing which you're allowed to do. They're a thing which you're allowed to make a choice about whether you do or not, and the way in which you do them. So, for example, if I guarantee you freedom of speech, that doesn't mean you're just allowed to say nasty things. It means you're allowed to make the choice as to what you say, and you're allowed to opt out of that at any time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. I'm not saying anything bullshitty yet. Great. So when we talk about things like the right to life, we also implicitly talk about the right to control what happens with respect to your life, and and without controlling, obviously, things with respect to the lives of others. Okay, so there are kind of two general theories and two extremes of how rights come about, and they clash quite a lot. Now, there's obviously the sort of idea that you have natural rights, which are guaranteed by some divine authority or some natural law of the universe. And then the other side of this, the flip side, is that there are no natural rights. The only rights you have are those which are guaranteed to you by the society within which you live. Now, can anyone tell me a problem with the first of those things?
The idea that they're just automatic rights that just exist by virtue of human existence.
It's right of life. Isn't it?
Sure, yeah, but what would be a problem with that account of how rights work?
Restrictions of these natural rights.
Sure, okay. In addition to which rights are natural, how are they accounted for, where do we get them from? If we say that we have natural rights and they... Cheers. Water break. It's like an advert for mineral water. Right. So if we say that you have a natural right to something, it's a God-given right or divine right or any of these things, the problem is that you don't give any real account of how that right actually accrues. So, particularly within debating context, that's really problematic because usually, within discourse outside of debates, it's quite easy for me to say, I have this right because God gave it to me and it says so in the Bible. If you say that in the context of a debate, everyone's just going to laugh you out of the room. And so the sort of natural rights account doesn't really hold quite as easily without a great deal of analysis.
And it's also problematic because it can lead you to who decides what right is actually a right. It means that one person could just assert that having access to the internet is an automatic or given right, whereas someone could assert on the other side no, it's not. When you put those two together, you don't actually get any real degree of who's right and who's wrong, which makes it very difficult to play out well in the debate.
Sure. On the flip side, there are also real problems with the sort of societal account of why rights exist. So, if I say that the only rights which exist are those which a society guarantees to me, then there are a few problems with that. One is who composes society and which part of the society decides which rights are allowed. Two is, what if the rights which I believe I'm entitled to, for example, the right to life, are then taken away by that society, is that legitimate? Probably not. And in addition to that, there's probably another issue with that. It basically means that you sort of take a hard moral relativist stance, where you say that everything's fine as long as it's in a certain context, which is really, really problematic when it comes to, trying to justify things like genocide, or murder, or rape, because you don't particularly want to be able to justify those things because they're pretty nasty. And so when you say that the society you live in decides which rights you are allowed to have and when you are allowed to have them, then you give that society the power over your right to life, or your power over your right to movement. And if it decides that you don't have them anymore, then you're a bit screwed.
Yeah, that's often pretty difficult to defend as well. People are just able to bring up examples of states where they have done not nice things for particular groups of people, right? So just because, like for example, during apartheid in South Africa, because that state had decided that black people had less rights, that's a very difficult stance to then defend when it is that you're being attacked by the other side saying actually rights are inherent and they don't depend on the state that you're born into because you happen to be born into that particular state.
Sure. So can anyone think of an account of how rights occur, or where we get them from, which falls between these two extremes and might give us a more balanced view of how they work?
Social contract theory.
Yeah, so social contract theory is sort of much maligned concept within debating, because the obvious response to social contract is, I didn't decide anything. Yeah. And the obvious objections are, it's not easy to leave the country. Where would you go? Where would you go? There is no choice to opt out of it, etc., etc. You were born into it, you didn't actually opt in. The problem is that social contract theory is probably the most, apart from those objections, the most robust account. No? It's one of them. For the purposes of intermediate level debate rooms, it's one that will probably serve you fairly well. What would you say is better?
An analysis of why something in and of itself is a right and why in that specific context that particular thing should be a right.
Okay.
So what I often find useful, so often people can go down the social contract theory route, but I think there are quite obvious objections to that. Something which I find is usually the most persuasive is focusing on the individual right itself that's at issue. So if, for example, I don't know, it's a debate about incitement to hatred, or if it's a debate to do with some sort of speech, it's quite important to people to look very specifically at that particular type of speech, or that particular issue of right that you're talking about. And often what's quite useful is drawing analogies to other things that people would often think are right. So nobody's probably going to dispute that people don't have a right to freedom of speech. But what they might dispute is where that limit falls. What's acceptable speech? What's okay? And what you need to do is analyse very specifically that particular issue and draw analogies to explain why it falls under the same kind of boundaries or in the same category as other things which people tend to view as kind of inherent fundamental rights.
Yeah. So the important thing here is that within your 7-minute speech, you, thank God, don't have to build up a comprehensive account of moral philosophy and how rights work. Because if you were to do that, you would not only not be able to fit it all within your speech, you would probably, try to take account of several hundred years, if not several thousand years, of complex moral philosophy, which I doubt most of us are capable of, completely comprehending. So, as Scott says, what you're trying to do is draw analogies to things which people already agree about. So when we say, that our right to life is something which is guaranteed either by the state or by anyone else, or whatever, we can draw analogies to we can probably draw analogies from other rights to the right to life because of the fact that the right to life is generally viewed as quite fundamental. And so these analogies are useful heuristics to guide the adjudication team and sort of the other debaters as to the direction of the argument. So obviously within a debate you obviously want to get all of your points pinned down to some kind of point of consensus which everyone ideally agrees on. And so you would just extend upon that point up to something which wouldn't normally be agreed on, but the analysis which you've given allows it to be. And so like that is in a way exactly what you're going to be doing with rights. So if we try and talk about, should we use an example?
Yeah.
I guess like the most common rights arguments you're going to have are feminism, gay rights, and animal rights, I guess. Probably, yeah. I hear you guys have probably did feminism earlier, quite possibly. So we'll sort of look at one of the latter. Minority rights. Yeah. So, what's the easiest example to use in this one? Protection from hate crimes. Okay. So, like, there's a legitimate debate to be had about whether hate speech or hate crimes, well, probably hate speech is the easiest one, is something which you're entitled to, which comes under freedom of speech, and whether incitement to things like racial violence or sexually oriented violence is something which you're allowed to have within society. Now, the problem here, what makes it a debate is the fact that different countries have come to different conclusions on this. So if you go to the United States, they say that no matter what you say, that is fine. The state cannot persecute you or prosecute you for saying anything. Whereas if you go to the UK or the majority of the European Union, there are guarantees against hate speech, which are really, really problematic in certain senses. Particularly stuff about sort of incitement to religious violence and that sort of stuff, particularly in the wake of 9/11 and since then, when there has been a rise of fundamentalism of various religions, and where there is a legitimate argument that a lot of what some religious leaders say is incitement to religious violence. So whether or not we guarantee that right, the right to say things which could incite others to commit violent acts, or to hold racist or homophobic or whatever beliefs is a legitimate point and is one which we debate quite a lot.
Yeah. So often then, in that situation, what you're trying to do is not only establish what rights exist, but how various competing rights interplay with each other. So often it's not just going to be a debate where you are arguing whether or not someone has a right to one particular thing. You're arguing about competing different rights from one group to another group. So in that debate, for example, you've got the right of an individual or a group of individuals to air their opinion about what they think, to air their views, to be able to say what they want and what they feel. On the other hand, you've also got the rights of the groups that are being targeted in terms of, firstly, how they feel, secondly, what the effect is upon them individually, but also then collectively as a group. And often in that sort of debate, you need to try and not only, the way to try and establish which right is the one which should have the upper hand when they come into clash, is looking at kind of what the context is. So it's often very useful, for example, if it's particularly if it's a racial group or if it's a group of people who are like LGBT, what they've been affected to in the past, what's happened to them in the past, how they've been treated by society, how they've been treated by other people, how collectively as a group has the state dealt with them. And often when you're looking at these sorts of groups, it's useful to explain the context if you're on the side of trying to promote what's in their best interest, by looking at kind of the way in which society has viewed them traditionally and the impact that's had upon their lives individually, but also as a group as well, in terms of when you're weighing up who it is that should have the overriding claim to that particular right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't compare rights within a vacuum. You can't just say that this person should have this right fundamentally, regardless of whatever. And you could. You probably wouldn't get very far with it. Now, because we debate in a broadly utilitarian structure, basically what you're going to be ending up doing is balancing the harms to any given group, depending on which side you take. So, as Scott said, within the debate about hate speech, you're going to be balancing the harms to a group of not being able to express their opinions against the harm to a group of possibly having violence incited against them. There are obviously more subtle sort of things there, such as if you prevent people from expressing their opinions, it is quite possible that they will express them through other means, such as directly, committing violent acts, or
going on to the internet and like anonymous profiles on forums inciting hatred and more violent means, which aren't as well regulated as they would be if you were able to do them in open and public forums.
I mean, there's quite a strong argument that it's good to know the spectrum of public opinions within a society, because that way you can control for them, and you can ensure that not only is the government doing stuff to make sure that various groups are placated and happy within society, which leads to bad things not happening, but also because it means that people are aware of the spectrum of views and aren't worrying about reds under the beds or the gay agenda, all that sort of stuff, because of the fact that everything's out in the open.
Yeah, like a good example of this quite recently in the UK at least is under the UK Equality Act, you can't turn away people from services that you offer to the public because of their sexual orientation or their gender, their age, or whatever. And a Christian couple, this happened quite a few times, who run a bed and breakfast type hotel thing, turned away a gay couple because they didn't want some people who weren't married living under their roof. But the argument that they were putting forward was that it's their religious beliefs and their right, therefore, to decide whether or not they offer service to these particular people who they don't think should be sleeping in the same bed together. Whereas on the other side, there's the competing view of people shouldn't be turned away because of their sexuality, and they've got a right to exist in the same way that everybody else does as individuals with whoever they want. So I think one of the main things is working out what's the biggest harm. Is it a group feeling that they cannot express themselves or be who they are, who feel that their kind of identity has been assaulted, not just individually, but because of the kind of historical issues with LGBT rights, means that as a kind of group, as a collective, kind of turning away a couple of people is actively harmful to everyone else because they feel that they can't be who they are. Or people's rights to feel that they're doing what God wants them to do. And so weighing up those particular things and explaining kind of what the impact actually is and why that's important is often the way to try and work out which competing view should be the one that wins.
I mean, generally, we try to want to protect historically or systemically oppressed groups, particularly within debates, because we say that the majority are fairly well off, they can probably fend for themselves, and that what you end up with in these debates is not saying that the majority's rights supersedes that of the minority, but we end up with an argument about who best protects the rights of that minority. So what you'll generally end up with, say in the hate speech debate, is not a debate about whether my right to freedom of speech supersedes your right to not get hurt in violent race-motivated crime, but whether or not guaranteeing my right to freedom of speech, regardless of what I'm saying, is going to help or hinder the plight of generally racially oppressed people. Are there any questions so far? No? Are we being hideously boring?
You are.
No? Nothing? No? No queries, no questions, nothing? Brilliant. Inquiring minds at their finest.
Yeah. Cool. So like Tim said, often when you get these sorts of debates about group rights or kind of collective individuals, it ends up being about which side both is best at kind of protecting those individuals or protecting those rights. Often one of the biggest kind of, sometimes if it's a particularly kind of progressive motion about doing something to help people with LGBT rights, often lots of proposition teams expect for some reason the other side to stand up and say that LGBT groups, for example, shouldn't have this particular rights. What's most effective and what good opposition teams will do is just explain why it is that policy is particularly harmful to that group of people. So looking at why it is that it hinders them. And there are a number of ways that they can do that. So they can look at why it is that it might buy into a particular narrative about those groups, that they've got a particular agenda that they're running. If you look at, for example, the Daily Mail, which is the world's largest or most viewed online newspaper in the world, it often portrays kind of a gay agenda where there are people pushing their kind of gayness on other people and forcing it into the public agenda. And often that creates a backlash by people saying, oh, fine, we're happy with you to be gay, but we don't want to push down our throats, thank you very much, stop it, which means that you get this kind of backlash into more kind of harmful policies or harmful stances or harmful public attitudes to people of that particular group, which is one of the probably the most effective opposition ones to go down in those sorts of debates.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably kind of like a lot of minority rights stuff. I can't, nothing immediately springs to mind. Should we look sort of fairly briefly at some animal rights stuff? Because that's often debated and debated really badly.
Yeah.
So there was a round at Cambridge this year, which was this house would guarantee cetaceans, i.e. dolphins, and primates, e.g. monkeys, apes, etc. The same rights of right to life, freedom of movement, and freedom from physical harm as humans. Now, broadly, this was partly because it was the first round, debated really badly. In essence, it's just a rights debate. It's just a question of where do rights come from and why should we guarantee them to certain groups. And we heard all kinds of weird things about why we guarantee rights to people. So there was one room where someone said that we guarantee rights based upon the size of a certain part of something's brain, which is obviously ridiculous because it means that we don't give any rights to mentally retarded children or babies. Which you don't really want to do because then you end up saying, well, we can just commit infanticide and that's cool. Unless you're Peter Singer, you don't make that argument. And there were other, I think in the room I was in, we ended up actually giving the win to a team which ran hard moral relativism and said, the only rights you have are those guaranteed by society. For some reason, nobody brought up the obvious objection to this, which is how the hell are you going to protect against things like murder if your society decides that you don't want to have them anymore. So, and then the other thing that people do is they say, well, rights are this ever-expanding sphere that we have. So there's this historical tradition of expanding the rights that we give to people. So first, rich people had rights, and then we gave rights to poor people, and then we gave rights to women, and then we gave rights to people of different races, and then we're giving rights to gay people, and next we'll give rights to animals, because that's the next logical step. So there needs to be some kind of glue that brings the animals next to the humans, rather than just saying, we think the next step from gay people is animals.
I mean, it was an argument put forward in the UK's House of Lords against gay marriage. Some people actually think that's valid argumentation.
There was that great one in the House of Lords who was like, well, if we allow gay marriage, then we're going to have a lesbian for Queen.
Maybe, but not necessarily.
What's the problem? Even if
That's a very bad thing. Yeah. Okay, so where do we start with animal rights?
So, I think one of the things that people often do in kind of animal rights debates is just assert a lot of things. I think that what's quite useful is to start off on a platform where you lay out the sorts of generally accepted rights that we have for people, right? So, for example, the right to life, for the right to kind of bodily autonomy, for the right to not kind of be molested by the state, unwarranted, or by other people unwarranted. And from that, you then need to draw the links as to why it is that animals are therefore similar and why they deserve the same degree of respect in terms of having rights that exist. You can do that in a number of ways. You can look at, firstly, kind of the idea of the fact that they are living things which have their own kind of autonomy in terms of brain power, or in terms of kind of nerves, or in terms of kind of feelings, right? They're able to, they know they exist, and they are aware of things around them, which means that they therefore have some capability of feeling or some capability of being considered like an individual autonomous agent. And from that, but from kind of drawing that link or making that kind of analogy, showing why that's therefore important for the specific right that you're talking about with animals, that they should be deserving of that particular right in the same way that humans are of that as well.
Sure. There's a really interesting argument for why we should guarantee rights to animals, and it extends to humans, which is their capacity for suffering. So there's this idea, which actually a lot of people, a lot of vegetarians, a lot of vegans buy into, and they say that the reason that we shouldn't eat meat, treat animals badly, do vivisection, do medical experiments on animals, particularly cosmetic experiments on animals, the last one's fairly indefensible. Like, I wouldn't try defending cosmetic experiments on animals. It's probably a bad thing.
People just don't need foundation.
Exactly. The reason that we should not do any of these things is not because animals are conscious or any of these things, because consciousness is incredibly hard to prove. I'll get onto that in a bit because I like science. But because they have capacity to suffer. So there's quite a large debate over whether fish have the capacity to suffer, because they have some nerve endings but they're fairly limited, and we don't really know whether they just feel how much pain they feel, if they feel pain, if they really feel misery. If you've ever seen a depressed fish outside Finding Nemo. But it's fairly well documented that mammals, particularly primates, dolphins, etc., have the capacity to suffer and do suffer when they are harmed or when they are mistreated in some way, when they are restricted from moving in a certain way. This is why people argue against zoos, because they say that they are put in an unnatural environment, they're put in a cage, they're put in a situation where they cannot move freely, where they actually end up feeling quite miserable, and this is actualized in certain ways. For example, certain animals will not mate in captivity, and people say that this is representative of their suffering. They say that they will not eat in captivity, or they don't want to eat properly, or they will not grow properly, or they will not, or they won't exhibit the same kinds of behaviours in captivity as they do in the wild. Now, there's a little bit of an ontological gap between those two things, of exhibiting these behaviours and saying this must be because they suffer. There's obviously a lot of other factors we can bring into it, but unless the other team sort of picks that out, you're probably fairly sure that you're safe in making that kind of argument. The interesting thing about the suffering argument is that it actually eliminates the rights of certain groups of humans. Not eliminates, but diminishes. And, for example, Peter Singer, who's the sort of main proponent of this argument, actually said this is a good thing. So he actually uses this argument to justify not only being nice to animals, but also euthanasia and infanticide in situations where a baby is disabled beyond the point where they're actually going to have a good life.
Yeah. Or someone who's just in a coma.
Yeah, exactly.
Unable to get out of it.
So he says that because these groups of people do not have the capacity to feel suffering, there is nothing wrong with us putting them out of the sort of misery that they're causing other people. So if they're incapable, if they're in a vegetative state, or if they're incapable of feeling anything themselves, or obviously if they're in a life of just pain, then they're probably going to be causing suffering to other people than themselves as well. Because of the fact that most people have families, or most people have friends, most people have some kind of community around them, and to see someone in that kind of pain is really, really hard. So this is why, for example, the families of people with Alzheimer's disease don't particularly like visiting their relatives in the last stage of the disease, because it's incredibly difficult to see someone who has, who used to be so vibrant and so full of life, diminished and degraded to the point where they can no longer remember your name. And they like to remember them as they were, rather than in the way that they are now. And that's how you can justify things like euthanasia not just in the case of people with Alzheimer's, but also at the early stages of life, in sort of not just pregnancy, but also when babies are born.
Yeah. Another way, though, that is often encountered is protection of vulnerable groups. So looking at, because someone is more vulnerable than you, because you have greater capability over protecting people, you've got an ability to make sure that they're looked after, that they're protected, that you therefore have a duty to make sure that those individuals are looked after and are protected, which is kind of like a stewardship of life type argument, where because you have a greater capacity, you have a duty therefore to make sure that those who have a lesser capacity are protected in the way that they ought to be by virtue of existing. So you can make arguments, you can draw links from that by looking at the same way that parents have a duty over their children, right? Not necessarily just because they were the ones who created the kids, but because of the fact that the kids exist in and of themselves and are more vulnerable and need protected. They need fed, they need looked after. And you can draw that even if therefore the parents aren't able to do that, then it's someone else's duty, someone else's part of the family, or ultimately the state has a duty to look after those individual people or those groups that are more vulnerable. And that's often a kind of a useful way of explaining why it is that just because someone is more vulnerable than you or doesn't necessarily have the same capacity, they also do have a duty to have, they do also have a right to have their rights protected, which is one of kind of the arguments you can make for animal protection and animal rights, is just because they are more vulnerable, just because they are weaker, or humans have a greater ability to, create a gun and shoot it at a tiger's head. Because we have that ability, we therefore should kind of steward them and make sure that they are protected, which is kind of quite a useful way of talking about the rights of these individual groups.
Of course, there are a few problems with this, because it is enshrined in law in a lot of places that animals are guaranteed certain protections from unnecessarily cruel treatment. The UK was sort of champions of this. Late 19th century, vivisection becomes a huge thing, experimental physiology becomes a huge thing, and people get quite disgusted by the public experiments they start seeing on things like dogs, because people have quite a visceral reaction to that kind of thing. And sort of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals springs out of that. It's quite interesting trivia is that the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children comes after the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and is a subsidiary of it. So it's actually it's not that it's old, it's newer and sort of less guaranteed than the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
Dogs before babies.
Dogs before babies. So the interesting thing is the question: who protects the rights of animals? Whether it's the job of the state, whether it's the job of the individual. So, for example, there was a really interesting case a little while back in the United States where someone attempted to sue the government for damages that they said were being done to the population of dolphins, not just around the United States, but around the entire world. So they tried to sue the government on behalf of every single dolphin. For reference, this is called the cetacean community versus Bush. And basically the court dismisses him because they say, you're some hippie and you don't actually, you don't represent all these dolphins. Sorry, mate. And the question is, who does? Obviously dolphins can't appear in a court of law in a little tank and sort of speak for themselves. We can't translate dolphin. We can't really guarantee them freedom of speech. So the question is, how do we account for the needs of animals when they cannot communicate for themselves? And who protects that? Who is the guardian of that? As Scott said, it's really important to guarantee the rights of vulnerable groups, and in certain circumstances we will probably say that animals, particularly endangered animals or animals which have human-like qualities, are vulnerable groups. But the question is, how do we do that, and who does it? The other important thing to do, firstly, are there any questions about this? No? Cool, okay. The other important thing to do in terms of looking at animal rights debates and animal rights in general is to draw a strong distinction between animal welfare and animal rights. So when we talk about animal welfare, we're talking about things like not kicking puppies and you generally don't get your pet cat and put it in the blender. because those things are unnecessarily cruel. They're just welfare. We think that not only are they like horrible, horrible things to do to sorry.
Hannah Blender.
I watched this show yesterday where someone was talking about the worst Christmas they ever had. They gave their mum like a kitten for Christmas, but they wrapped it in an airtight Tupperware container. Poor kitten died. Anyway, animal welfare. So, the difference is that not only are these things horrendously cruel things to do to animals which are capable of suffering in and of themselves, but also they tend to show bad things in the humans that do them. So like they manifest themselves in people like sociopaths and psychopaths, who we generally don't particularly like because they do nasty things like hurting animals and like hurting humans. And so like we guarantee the right, not the rights, but the welfare of animals in these sorts of circumstances. There's a delineation or distinction between the welfare, which is basically don't be a real absolute dick to animals, and rights for animals. So the way this distinction falls is, if you talk about animal rights, you're not just trying to prevent cruelty to animals, which is like wanton and completely unnecessary. You're also playing off the rights of the animals against the rights of society which is using them. So we're talking about things like the medical testing on animals. We're talking about things like having them in zoos. So these are things which we say provide good public services, and which, for example, medical testing on animals not only provides drugs for humans and prevents like lots of humans dying during drug trials, but also actually provides lots of drugs for animals, which we use in veterinary practice. So like one of the reasons that we say we shouldn't stop using animals in medical testing is because of the fact that in order to get drugs which we can use to guarantee the welfare of animals, we have to use animals for medical testing. Otherwise, you're going to be testing drugs on humans to use on animals, which is a wonderful reversal of roles. So this distinction between rights and welfare is where welfare, there's no real trade-off. There's nothing which you're really trading off other than your ability to just be nasty to animals. Whereas rights, there is going to be a trade-off. You have to play off the rights of the animals against the rights of the humans with which populate that society.
So I think one of the natural places to go then from that is an objection that's often used to the whole kind of animal testing type thing and kind of rights stuff in general, which is consent. So one of the big reasons why people object to these sorts of things is because the animals have no way of assenting that they are happy for them to be used in that particular way for kind of human or animal end games. Whereas the distinction is, with humans have the capacity and the agency to not only make that decision, but also to express that decision in an affirmative way. Obviously, there are lots of arguments against that in terms of looking at the sorts of people who would sign themselves up to kind of medical experiments are probably going to be the ones who who are coerced by kind of financial pressures, right? You're not going to get some multi-millionaire who's like, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to sign up to be tested with loads of drugs in my body. Right? It's going to tend to be someone who's quite desperate for money, who needs to eat, who needs to pay their bills. So looking at kind of consent from that area about why it's not necessarily real consent is a way in which you can kind of look at different rights issues in this way. That's also something which plays into the sort of euthanasia type argument. Because like Tim was saying, in terms of sort of the suffering and stuff that you have, you're not only considering the suffering that you're going through, but also the impact that you're having on other people around you. And there are some interesting arguments on each side in terms of the euthanasia or assisted suicide debate, but whether or not a decision that you make in order to end your life because of the impact it's having on other people is necessarily a valid choice. Because of that, essentially you're like ending your life because you feel bad for other people, because of other people's pressure on you. So looking at kind of external pressures as opposed to internal decision making and consent. So I think that's one of kind of the big arguments that you can bring up in terms of consent is also not just the reasons behind people's decision making. Essentially, what are the pressures that they're under? What internal pressures are they considering? Are they maybe thinking that they want to end their lives because they view themselves as a burden on their family members or other people? But that might not actually be true, right? So you could have a situation where people are dying because of the fact that they think they're a burden on their family members, but in fact their family members would prefer them to exist, which is one of kind of the big arguments against allowing people to choose to die. Or you could look at it from the other aspect of kind of external pressures, but whether or not people feel that they are being pressured either by money or by a huge number of reasons to make a particular decision which will have a long impact on them.
Yeah. So coming back on this idea of sort of consent, quite often within medical testing and that sort of thing, we don't just talk about consent in the same way that we do with sex. So with sex, we say, you are able to consent as long as you're not like intoxicated or underage. Whereas what we say with medical testing and drugs testing in particular is that you have to be aware of the consequences of your consenting to a certain thing. Well, this does come to sex as well. So, for example, when I sign up to be in a phase 1 drug trial, does everyone know how drug trials work? Does anyone know how drug trials work? No? I guess I can explain that. It's quite important in terms of like understanding like medical testing. Okay, cool. Right. So like the drug trial happens in 3 phases, and this is like really, really important for any debate you have about like medical testing or pharmaceuticals or anything like that. Hopefully you should have a debate about that. It makes me really sad when nobody puts science questions up. So what happens is it takes about $500 million to go from an idea of a drug to taking that drug to market. And in the course of that, you not only have to first come up with an idea of a drug and then model it on a computer and think about its interaction with other drugs, interaction with other things in the body, and that sort of stuff. And then you have to test it in animals, and you have to get shitloads of like licenses and stuff to test it both in one primate animal and one non-primate animal. So you have to test it, for example, in an ape and also a rat. And then when that is done, you also test it in cells first. So like you do a shitload of tests before you get to humans, because you want to make sure that it's not toxic, you want to make sure that it's not going to kill everyone that you give it to. When you get to the human part, you have like phase 1, which will have a small number of volunteers for, so you're talking like 50 people. So these people aren't ill. These people are volunteers, and they're usually paid for their time. So they come in, and this is just a test for toxicity. So they're not trying to test whether the drug works, because obviously these people don't actually have a disease the drug is designed for. They're just trying to test what the adverse effects of that drug are. So they're trying to test, whether people can tolerate it, whether they're going to break out in a rash, whether they're going to get, suddenly cancer, and that sort of stuff. And like there are a few problems with this kind of thing, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then you have phase 2, where you have sort of 100 to like 500 people who do have the disease. And this is sort of the experimental phase where they're trying to find out whether this drug is like actually effective or not. And basically, this is where in all those films where people say, "I'm sorry, there's no hope." But there is a new experimental treatment which we're trying, which will put you on, and then they miraculously get better. Like, chances are it probably won't happen. But this is where we test for like efficacy as well. And then you have like phase 3, which is where sort of not consent, but the way in which we do drug trials gets really, really interesting. So you have like 5,000 people at this phase, and you distribute it all around the country, and you have it's double blind. So the idea is that it has to be, nobody's allowed to know, like, whether they're getting the drug or not. So you give them either the drug or you give them a placebo, and like half and half. And it's distributed so that not only the doctors don't know, and not only the patients don't know, also the doctors don't know who's getting what. So you can accurately track who's getting what effects without sort of placebo effects added in. And so that after that, and only after that, can you bring a drug to market. Now the problem with phase 1 trials is that they're usually done, as Scott said, on financially disadvantaged groups. So we're talking students, homeless people, drug addicts, etc. Or your friends, because he lives in Scotland, or doesn't, or did. like, drug addicts and sort of Scottish people are fairly synonymous.
Alcoholics.
And alcoholics. So the problem with this is not just that you're going to kind of ruin the results of your trials, because if you've got drug addicts coming in and sort of taking these drugs, you're going to have different effects to the effects you're going to have if you're putting it into some like clean middle class person. You've also got the problems of consent, which is where the right stuff comes in, which is why this is not completely related. So there's a fair argument to be made that you cannot give informed consent to this kind of thing. The reason being that pharmaceutical companies are really, really big, and they have lots and lots of money. And what they say is, oh, come into our drug trial, we'll give you money. And they're meant to guarantee you that money whether you stay in the drug trial or not. The problem is that they don't. So, in a large number of cases, when people go into a drug trial, if it's too much for them to tolerate, they're getting really bad side effects and they want to drop out, they don't get the money that they were guaranteed. And so they have a choice. They can either stay in and tolerate really horrific side effects, or they can drop out and not get money, which they probably need to buy food to be able to live. And so that's basically coercion, and something which means that you cannot give informed consent to that kind of research, because not only because they're a financially disadvantaged group and are relying on that money to be able to live. I think that's most of what I have to say on that.
Do you have any questions about any of that sort of stuff?
Is it the same situation with prostitution?
Yeah, it's very similar.
Yeah, looking at kind of the internal and external pressures that the person's facing, meaning that depending on what side you're arguing, it means that they can happily consent to it, or in fact the consent is initiated and they're unable to because of the reasons that they're making that decision.
And like, if you had a feminism workshop, let's say, I imagine like this is where the argument that all sex is rape and all men are rapists come from. It's not like conjured out of thin air. It comes from like a logical conclusion of the idea that you cannot give informed consent if you're in a disadvantaged position and being coerced into an act. And that's where that comes from. Cool. How are we doing for time? Pretty well. I think we can go for like an hour or something stupid. Great. Does anyone have like any other questions? Yes? Ooh.
Can we talk about rights in the context of IR, like with innovations?
Sure.
Yeah,
I think you all got quite close to that.
So in terms of when it's legitimate for you to intervene in, for example, a contract, right? Because when you get a lot of kind of different motions and to do with IR and start shining about kind of military intervention type of things. So often you won't just the sort of context of the debate that will be said.
Just a moment.
Hi. Hi.
What we do?
Okay. Yeah. So often in terms of debates that you'll get about IR in terms of military interventions, there's not going to be like this house would invade random X country, right? It's usually going to be some sort of intervention based on something that is happening within that country, and usually a rights-based issue for a particular group of people in terms of maybe genocide, or in terms of sort of civil internal wars or conflicts that are going on within that country. And lots of people argue along the lines of like we have a duty to protect individuals within these countries and we're more powerful, therefore like we should be able to do it. Not necessarily the strongest argument that can be made with that respect. What usually you need to do in terms of a military intervention motion is establish kind of human rights or group rights in general. So you establish the fact that individuals are born, and when they are born with a kind of number of like incredibly important rights, be that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to vote, freedom from kind of bodily harm, all those sorts of things that people generally regard as quite important. And usually in a debating context, one of those rights will be being oppressed or harmed in the state that you're meant to be militarily intervening in. So when you've established that people are deserving of those rights, you then need to go on to what a state's duty is. So looking at what the nature of a state is. And I think probably the strongest way to argue that is that, like, we recognise that these individual rights that people have are important for all people. It's not based on where you're born. Just because somebody happens to be born in Zimbabwe doesn't mean that they've got any lesser rights than somebody who happens to be born in the United States, right? Human beings are human beings and should all be deserving of those rights that we think are fundamentally incredibly important. The way that we split the world up in terms of states is done like kind of mainly on a, and this is like, well, this is how I think you draw the argument, is mainly done on a practical basis. That it's very difficult, right, to have kind of a worldwide kind of body in charge of making sure that everybody's governed in a particularly fantastic way. That we split up people into states based on geographical convenience. And convenience in a way which means that people have rights with respect to the cultures or the religions or whatever for those states that they're brought up into. But then, and because of that, the states therefore like have a duty to try and protect the individual rights of their people and also have kind of more tailored kind of rights specific to the group of people within that country based on their context. What you then need to look at, I think, is when a state is either ignoring the rights of people, kind of fundamental rights, or the state is actively oppressing a right, it therefore loses its legitimacy as being able to have a monopoly of power or a monopoly of violence over that group of people because of the fact it's abusing its position. When that happens, it therefore falls as a duty to other countries to make sure that individual rights are protected and are looked after within that country. Because when the state itself is failing to do that, then other states have a duty to do it because of the fact that the people there are humans as well and should be therefore be looked after regardless of where they happen to be born. I think it's when you make those sorts of links and those sorts of arguments that you're then better able to justify some sort of intervention into other countries because of the oppression of individual or group rights within those countries. That's one of the big reasons why, for example, genocide is a reason that the United Nations allows countries to go and invade other countries. And that's because kind of within a genocide states are targeting a particular group of people. You can expand that analogy, you can kind of draw an analogy to that when a state's maybe just killing people indiscriminately in terms of like a war. That it shouldn't, like, states shouldn't have a duty to intervene just when a particular group is being targeted. Like, if it's indiscriminate killing, right, those individuals still have a right to be protected as well. And that's why it is that you should be able to then kind of go in and make sure that those rights are protected. And I think that when you kind of establish that framework, establish that legitimacy in terms of being able to go in and do something, the burden then falls to you to then point out why it's going to be effective and why it's actually going to work. Because all of that is dependent on individual or group rights who are being oppressed by being made better and being helped by your intervention. And so when you've established that framework of when it's legitimate to intervene, you then need to explain how it's going to be effective and how you're actually going to protect those rights that you think are important and you want to go and solve.
I mean, quite often what you'll see in intervention debates is obviously all this good stuff with regards to sort of legitimacy and the degrading that legitimacy when a state commits acting to some people. But what the kind of trap that teams opposing intervention fall into is they spend a great deal of time outlining, a detailed plan of national sovereignty and and how a nation state is sovereign over its own people and has the one and only true right to do what it likes with the people, and how, like, if we invade, then we degrade that sovereignty and it screws up the state because it no longer has power. The problem is that then Prop comes along and says, well, our policies save lots of lives, and then you're really screwed. Because of the fact that we work within this broadly utilitarian framework, if you can prove that your policy is going to probably result in less people dying, you can probably override concerns about, like, the sovereignty of that state. Now, obviously, the obvious rebuttal to this is, if you degrade the sovereignty of the state, then it's going to result in, like, instability in the future, which could result in more people dying. But like it's a bit of an elliptical way to go about it, and it's not particularly effective by comparison to the sort of legitimacy argument that Scott outlined there.
Like if I'm opposition to kind of military intervention things, proposition often spend a lot of time talking about kind of legitimacy and why they therefore have a right to intervene, and sometimes fail to explain like why it's actually going to be effective. One of the first things I do in opposition is be like, I entirely agree about legitimacy, but like we can see all of that. But what we're going to prove is why it actually doesn't benefit people and makes the situation worse. So then by kind of countering their rights analysis about whether it's okay to intervene, having spent a lot of time on that, you're able to dismiss quite a lot of their argumentation by saying that you agree, but pointing out why it is that they fail to meet their own word and being able to protect those rights within the countries, why it either doesn't work or makes things worse.
In a lot of rights debates, ideally you don't want to be fighting about where rights come from, because that gets quite boring and get bogged down in our philosophy quite quickly. You ideally want to actually be agreeing on where rights come from, and agreeing kind of on what rights people have, but disagreeing vehemently on like how it's best to guarantee those rights and how we can best serve like different groups of people with different agendas. As Scott said, you basically need to talk about. I mean, this happened in the hate crimes or hate speech example as well. You need to talk about the way in which you can best serve the rights of people who are the most vulnerable.
Cool. Any questions about the dialogue?
And which other arguments can we make for the opposition side, but for the benefits and efficiency?
Yeah, I mean, you can do, I guess, who gets to decide on when something's appropriate to intervene, right? Who are the actors who are going to be making that decision about what is and what is not appropriate? And you can look in a way kind of the various vested interests of the actors who are most likely to be the ones who are intervening and the problems that creates. I think you can also
You can also talk about the way in which military interventions necessarily create instability in the region. So the most obvious example of this in recent years is Iraq, where 2003 we invaded lots of people. 2013, the whole place is still absolutely fucked.
Or even in terms of kind of regional instability, you just use the civil war in Syria to look at how that's having a problematic effect in Lebanon and also fringes of Turkey, as well as parts of western Iraq. So just how it is that conflict can kind of spill over borders. You can also look at the problems of Liberia and Sierra Leone, or the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to see how it is that kind of conflicts within a country are very quickly able to escalate into regional problems because of the fact that often places that we're going to be invading or having some sort of military intervention into don't have particularly fantastic borders, right? So it's very fluid over kind of different territories and different regions, which creates more problems in the long term, particularly when you've got kind of sectarian divides like Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, whatever. Throw the United States and a load of drones, then you get total mess.
Yeah. And the other thing is the idea that it not only creates instability in the region, but also perpetuates any kind of conflict which is going on. So the problem with military interventions is it's difficult to know when to stop. Are you going to stop when the human rights abuses stop? Are you going to stop when you depose the current government? Are you going to stop when you depose the current government, instigate some form of democratic election, and only get the kind of government that you actually think is appropriate? When do you stop? How do you do it? How do you guarantee these things? Because the moment you intervene in a region, you take on a huge burden of responsibility towards that region. So we can't just invade Iraq, say stop gassing the Kurds, and leave. Because the problem is that once you've gone in there, you've set foot there, you've obviously impinged on any kind of sovereignty, and you've said that you're not a legitimate government, you can't do these things.
And in doing so, you've dismantled the state apparatus, right? You've dismantled the kind of bureaucracy and civil service, you've dismantled the police force, you've dismantled the security services, you've dismantled the military. So all of the things for which you need a proper functioning state. You've gotten rid of, because in order to beat the state that you're invading, you need to get rid of those things. Meaning that, so Iraq was a total military success in terms of the invasion. The problem was phase 2 and phase 3, where it was reconstructing the country. So it's very easy to kind of prove on probably, probably, like the sorts of countries we're talking about, it might be NATO, it might be the United States, are probably going to launch quite a good military campaign and probably beat the people they're against. What they're not going to be so good at is that they're rebuilding the country in order to make sure that it's stable and an effectively well-governed society in the future. Hence the whole kind of Iraq mess.
Yeah, basically. And hence why you now have drones bombing the shit out of people in Pakistan, and why people are extremely angry about that. This is a leftover from a terrorist attack which happened 12 years ago. And once you start making military interventions, it's incredibly difficult to stop. And that's a very powerful weapon which you can bring on. You have to hold people to hold Prop to account for the continuing damage in the foreseeable and unforeseeable future which they're going to cause to a country and to a region. Not just in terms of lives lost, but also the way in which you, as Scott says, dismantle all the state institutions and basically leave them in a situation where they have no political capital, they have no way of digging themselves out of the huge mess that you put them in. And which obviously they themselves have contributed to, but which you have actualized into this complete dismantled state. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can I ask a question not connected with this motion, I guess, about rights?
Yeah, of course.
Since here are quite a lot of people who debate first year, and there is a huge difference between what you're talking about, ideas which you have bring a lot today, and argument which you really do during debating in your finals and so on. Can I ask you to bring one argument from the motion we have discussed, for instance, even hate speech, doesn't matter what, and just explain it very clearly, just one argument. I do not ask you to make a training for argumentation because it will be too long, but just one argument, and maybe even write down or point out the main points, because it's really a huge difference when I hear you and when I do my arguments, between ideas and between real arguments.
Yeah, and there's obviously a huge gap between what you know and what you say, and what you think you know and what you actually know, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, let's do that. What motion should we use?
Invading Syria.
Maybe something very easy, like hate speech, right of...
What do you say with hate speech? So this house would guarantee hate speech, apart from free speech. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's grab a water. So what we'll do is
So we have an off argument.
Maybe point out the main,
yeah, so we'll outline which arguments you would bring on in opening up an open opposition. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this house would guarantee hate speech as part of legitimate. As legitimate. Yeah, it's just as legitimate. That's fine. Cool.
Yeah. So,
Cool.
I reckon one of the first things that I would do on proposition would be to establish why it is that freedom of speech exists and why it is that it's important. So, as part of that, looking at why it is that we're afforded rights in terms of freedom of speech is important because it's a way of expressing our identity, what we believe, what we think, what we feel. We've got no other mechanism or vehicle by which we can do that, and we can explain to people what our ideas are. What you need to do from that is look at why it is that that's important, right? So people should be guaranteed to kind of bodily autonomy. They should be able to have a degree of control of what they're able to do within their lives, because it's their bodies, and ultimately they shouldn't be kind of under oppression of anyone else because it's them and they exist. And from that, looking at why it is, therefore, that freedom of speech is an important part of that. So, in terms of hate speech, I would... So, I think what you need to do is explain why it is that individuals do have a right to be able to hate other groups or to express an opinion about why they have a particular feeling or view of other people, right? So I think you need to explain, and it's difficult for me because I don't believe it, but explaining why it is that it's important for us in terms of expressing or actualizing our identity to be able to honestly say what it is we feel and express that in a way that's meaningful to us. Because ultimately free speech is something which is, like, it's one of those rights which isn't something that you kind of can hold, it's not something necessarily tangible, but it's something which is incredibly important about being able to define you as a person and what your identity is. And if you are oppressed by the state from expressing that view, expressing how you feel, then ultimately it's harmful to your identity and you as a person.
Sure. I mean, so that's a sort of individual view of like why freedom of speech is important. The second part of your case in this would be the societal benefits that this kind of freedom of speech brings. So this is sort of individual. And then we sort of talk about societal stuff. So as we were talking about earlier, one of the major benefits that that hate speech could actually bring to a society is the fact that it allows discourse to happen in an open and honest way. If so, basically, honesty of discourse. Now, why is this important? Why is it important that we're able to say, you know, I hate black people or I hate gay people? Why is that okay? Why is it not only okay to say that you hate someone because of like the colour of their skin? Why is it okay to say I hate gay people and I think they should all die? Why is that okay? Like, I don't think it is. But like, let's assume that like for the purpose of this, I do. So like, the idea is that when you have this kind of honesty of discourse, everyone's quite clear about what everyone else is thinking in a society. And this ideally should lead to like less crime and less, you know, underground bad stuff happening.
Yeah, because people, because they feel they are able to express their views without fear of kind of retaliation for the views that they hold, means that they are able to have those frank, open, and honest discussions. So what you need to do is kind of do a comparative. You need to look at what the world is like when people are able to express this, and what the world would be like where they still have these same views, but aren't able to express them in a way in which other people can hear them. And that's when you can start looking at kind of the more underground problems that exist. When you look at the fact that you get people going onto internet forums, anonymously being able to make things up, right? It's unregulated. It's not in a way in which you are able to take down opinions if they're lies, where they're untrue, or where they're just like stupid. Whereas what you allow within this is kind of a marketplace of ideas, where you're able to have kind of the expression of what people think, but you're also, because it's being aired publicly, are able to have a response from people pointing out why they disagree and why that's wrong. So that's got a number of ancillary benefits. One of which is, like, often you can convince people that, you know, their stupid, ignorant views are both stupid and ignorant, right? Because you're able to have a rational, reasoned debate pointing out the flaws within that. If you shut it off into a kind of underground sphere, then you're not getting that same sort of pointing out the flaws in what they're saying. All they're getting is the people who are quite extreme or like have particularly kind of polarized views, so they're not really getting dealt with in an open and honest way.
So the other thing is, the very act of enshrining this kind of protection, a protection from hate speech in law. So when I say that you cannot say these things, that law acts as a kind of spectre over all the discourse that we have. So what I mean by this is that because you are aware that this law exists, and that if you say the wrong thing or someone else says the wrong thing, you know, they could be fined or they could go to jail. You're not sure whether people are being honest or not. You're not sure whether the things that they are saying, the opinions they are expressing, are their true opinions, whether they really are, nice, moderate people who tolerate all walks of life, or whether they're secretly, a racist who would quite like to don a Ku Klux Klan hood and go and lynch people. And so, the main thing which breeds fear, and fear which breeds, crime and instability in society, is not knowing what's going on, is not being able to predict, what's going to happen next, because you don't actually know what other people think. You don't actually know whether everyone's a nice, lovely person, or whether they actually hate you. Like, if you're aware that a certain area in a town is a bad area and you don't go there, you don't go to that area. If you, if you think that the entire city is just one place where there's you might be attacked, but you also might not be. It's very, very difficult for you to then chart out a course which allows you to avoid that. I think that probably yeah.
What I'd probably then do next is, like we were talking about earlier, so you're wanting to also protect the rights of the groups who are probably going to be the target of the hate speech, right? You don't want to stand up on the proposition and be like, yeah, well, we're trying to have hate speech against these groups because we don't like these groups either. You're going to be trying to talk about why your policy is good for those groups. I think what you then do on proposition, once you've done these things, is look at how it is that a sort of law preventing hate speech leads to a backlash against those particular groups, right? Because now not only are those horrible gays that you dislike, I don't know, holding hands in public or whatever, and that makes you unhappy. Now they're also the reason that they're trampling on your freedom of speech. That they're the group who are the ones who are harming your rights, and that they're the ones who mean that you can't express what you think. And what that does is it leads to a backlash amongst people who might be kind of borderline, who aren't necessarily homophobes or racists, but who are a bit uneasy with that group, who are a bit ignorant of them. And what this does is it now labels them as not only a group that you're a bit uneasy of, they're a group who are actively oppressing your rights and your ability to say what you want. Because even if you didn't want to express homophobic or racist views in the first place, people quite like the idea of being able to raise views if they had them anyway. They like the idea of this sort of nebulous thing of freedom of speech. So when it is that you're prevented from doing that, people will find it a lot more believable to blame the particular group who they have a bit of a problem with. And that leads to a lot more problems for that group in and of itself.
Yeah, you can see this particularly in Britain actually, where there's this huge backlash against what people always term political correctness gone mad, where they say that you're not allowed to say the truth, and what they mean by the truth is racism, without scare quotes. By truth they mean racism. Because of the fact that these groups have made the government guarantee them, and the government are pandering to them. Particularly in the UK, you always get the idea that somehow Islam is really powerful, which is kind of weird. And they always say, these Islamic extremists have bullied the government into preventing us from saying what they're really doing, which is coming in with bombs in their turbans to kill everyone. And obviously the problem is that when you prevent people from saying these things, even though they are really horrible things to say, they get quite pissed off about that. As Scott already said, this is quite just a concrete example of how that happens. As we talked about earlier with the Daily Mail, with how they talk about the gay agenda, where they say the gay agenda is I don't know, what do they think the gay agenda is?
Anything that changes day by day.
Anything changes, yeah, pretty much. Whereas the gay agenda is really go to the shops, get some milk, come home, feed the cats. That's pretty much what most people do. It's probably the same for gay people. Because the Daily Mail is this sort of beacon of small c conservatism, it's meant to, it idealises itself as representing the views of groups who are the traditional Britain. I know we're making very,
who are
very...
now becoming the oppressed ones who are able to access their rights of freedom of speech.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is the same with this couple who were told, who were fined for not letting in a gay couple to sleep in their B&B. They say, you know, our right to religious freedom is being, and kind of freedom of speech, basically.
Yeah,
Oh,
Christians are now being oppressed.
Yeah, they say...
It changes the narrative from the group that are the ones who are actually traditionally oppressed, who, like, you know, get killed because of the fact that they've come out as gay or whatever, right? They're now changing the narrative in the press and in the media, particularly the right-wing media, to we're now the oppressed ones because these gays are trampling over our traditional values and what Britain used to stand for or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's fairly rigorous sort of going over an opening gulp on that one. Should we do off?
Yeah.
Cool. Has everyone got this? Yeah? Well, everyone got it who wants it. So, on opposition, you've kind of got an easier ride of it.
On this particular one.
Yeah. It's very easy to say that hate speech leads to bad things. You know, when you say, if there's a radical preacher in the street who's inciting you to go out and kill people because they're not of your particular religion, when you've got someone who's saying that this country isn't the way it used to be because of black people, and therefore we should deny them jobs and we should send them back to where they came from, or we should send Ray-Bans to Bongo Bands. That was so. The most recent one, again, sorry, we're using really Britain-centric examples here, but that's because that's where we live. So there's this politician called Godfrey Bloom. So he used to be part of the UK Independence Party, which is a party of undercover racists who shroud their racism in saying that they just don't like the European Union. They're kind of like the British National Party dressed up in a suit, but without the overt violence.
Yeah, so he pretend to be your mate so you can go to the pub with.
Yeah, exactly. So this guy came out and said that foreign aid, was it foreign aid?
Yeah, we should stop that.
Yeah, so he was saying that we should stop foreign aid because he said that foreign aid basically consisted of sending Ray-Bans to Bongo land, which is obviously kind of bad because you're implying that basically a horrific stereotype of all black people, and also the general plight of people who live in places which are privileged Western countries. So there's quite obvious harms to not only the concrete ones of inciting violence, but also the narrative stuff that you create when you allow hate speech. So let's quickly delineate these because I guess we're sort of how are we doing on time?
It's up to you, but we must leave the hall by 10 p.m.
I have no intention of going until 10. No.
Yeah.
I'm shattered. I'm sure you have time as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I would probably look at is the context of these particular groups, right? Because there's a reason that there are particular groups who are probably going to be the target of hate speech, right? It's not going to be hate speech against middle-class white people because they're middle-class and white. It's probably going to be traditionally repressed groups. So it might be LGBT, it might be people of different races, people of particular religions, right? So looking at why it is, the kind of the context of the oppression that they faced in the past, and why it is the kind of what actions have been taken against them because of their characteristic that's being targeted by this sort of speech. From that then, I think you look at what the impact of the speech is on those particular groups. So looking at the problems that exist when you allow this to happen, right? How a lot of the hate speech buys into traditional narratives about these individual groups, right? That all gays are paedophiles, or that all black people are going to go and stab you and murder your child. All these sorts of kind of things which are harmful to the group en masse, as well as the individual. So I think what you do is you try and delineate the impact. So I can say something horrible to Tim, about Tim, because I can, right? That impacts him. However, when you
kind of make an expression against somebody because they're gay or because they're black, it's not just having an effect on them, it's having an effect on the entire community of which they're from. Because they're a kind of traditionally repressed group, if I call someone like a horrendous name for someone being gay, I'm not just impacting that person, I'm impacting the entire community by making it already difficult, by making it even harder for them to maybe come out as gay, or making it more difficult for them to be able to get rid of the kind of stereotypes that exist about them because of that particular immutable characteristic.
Yeah.
And looking at why it is that just buys into the whole kind of collective narrative, which if you're able to make this speech, then you might be able to convince other people to buy into the stereotypes that existed in the past, which means that it's not just going to affect the person that you say it to, but will affect people in the future who are from that group, and why that's particularly bad.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, obviously, so the context of the groups is particularly important. Other than that, you've got like the obvious concrete harms, like
if I, start riling up a load of ignorant, like low-paid workers in Bradford or like the outskirts of Paris, to want to attack kind of all immigrants for coming over here and taking our jobs. That might lead to people being attacked for coming over here and taking all our jobs, when that might not necessarily be true, but it's also bad because like people are being attacked and hurt as a result of it. Why that's that.
Exactly. I think those are the main outlines, really. I mean,
Yeah, good women as well within that.
yeah, okay, so like, basically within any debate, you can probably bring in like feminism line. People often fall into the trap of like doing it as their extension if they run out of anything else to say.
Yeah,
you're
I'm not
going to
sure.
write very hard.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this would count as hate speech, would depend on kind of definition. But again, our friend Godfrey Bloom from the UK Independence Party, I think this was former. I think this is why he got chucked out or asked to leave. Was because at a conference with a load of female UKIP supporters, he called them all sluts for not washing the fridge properly, not cleaning the fridge properly. So
what's interesting is just the good context is, the word slut actually only acquired its sort of meaning in the common vernacular of like someone who has sex with other people quite recently. It used to mean someone who was like slovenly or untidy or lazy. So he was actually using it in that context. Although like, it doesn't excuse him being like a terrible human being anyway.
Yeah, he doesn't quite realise how the world has changed since 1830.
Yeah. When he was born.
Yeah. So so like what you can always kind of do is try and join like a big group that being oppressed. Because with minority, like you will always get some probably bad team being like, oh, but like these are minority and like other people should like have their rights protected because there are more people than this small group. So like we should benefit like lots of people as opposed to the small group. You can always bring in women to look at why it is that like females have traditionally been oppressed in terms of kind of how they're able to function within society, what the role within society is, and look at why it is that buying into that narrative is particularly harmful for about 52% of the population, and why that's particularly bad. There's something that people seem to forget. They always class women with minorities, except like they're not a minority, like quite a large proportion of the population, right? So you're always able to go run with not only the minority card, but also looking at the impact it has on people who, like a group of people who make up the majority of the population, and yet have been traditionally oppressed by the state and also society for the last few millennia.
Yeah, I think that's fairly good. Yeah, cool. Does that answer your question? Right. Hi.
I have a question that connected with international relationship sphere.
Sure.
Do we really break the basic rights of the country, such as independence, when, for example, one country tries to influence to another in economical way, for example, embargo?
Yeah. So you can look at the problems with that sort of stuff by explaining. So usually with that one,
I'd again go down the practical reasoning of like why it's particularly bad for the people of the country, right? So yeah, when you embargo a country or you put sanctions on a country, explaining why it is that ultimately the people who are going to be harmed are going to be the people who like have no say over the kind of the way that that country is operating or its foreign policy or whatever, and it's ultimately the people who are most vulnerable on the ground who are the ones who are being harmed or targeted by the sanctions. I think probably quite a good example is Zimbabwe.
North Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, where ultimately the people that suffer are the ones who I mean, they've got a shit life as it is, right? Now we're just making it a hell of a lot worse. I think like there are other debates you can make in terms of international stuff. For example, debates about aid, about Tide aid,
Debates about inciting rebellion, that sort of stuff. There was a great semi a while ago, which is like this house would subsidise Twitter in countries with like oppressive regimes.
Yeah.
Which is a really, really fun one.
Just something about just like a bit of trivia about IR stuff and aid. So there are a huge number of landlocked countries around the world that vote on the International Whaling Council, essentially allowing Japan to be able to like be really horrible to whales because they pay them money and also pay their membership into the organisation. So you've got countries which have got like literally no access to the ocean who are making policy on what Japan is able to do to whales because it coerces them by paying for their membership and also threatening to take away aid from them if they don't comply with them. I love the International Whaling Council. Such a mess.
I had an IR show, everything else going to say. Oh yeah, so like, if you want to get better at IR in particular, the easiest way to do it is to learn the names of lots of countries, learn the name of their capital city, and then learn the name of 2 politicians within each of those countries. That way, you know more than like 50% of all the people competing in IR debates. And then you can basically make up whatever shit you like about what's happening in that country, as long as it's like not like Iraq or Pakistan.
Burkina Faso is my personal favourite.
Yeah.
Nobody knows so all about Burkina Faso.
Precisely.
Yeah. What's also quite useful is to just have like a list of military interventions or whatever that have been either successful or crap. So people always talk about Iraq as the failure, like the standard, but then you can look at the success stories, right? You can look at Sierra Leone and Kosovo, where like after the interventions by NATO, or in Sierra Leone's case the UK, the most popular boy's name was afterwards Tony, and in Kosovo it was William after Bill Clinton, because they were very well executed interventions that were successful. You can also look at East Timor. I don't really know much about that, but you can throw that one out there, and Macedonia as well. And then you can also just have like a list of the ones that have not been good, right? So you're able to point to
Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Rwanda, basically any intervention. Well, lack of intervention.
Oh yeah.
Basically any intervention which the US made in the second half of the 20th century.
Apart from Kosovo.
Apart from Kosovo. So like any time they attempted to depose the South American government.
Yeah, Venezuela. That's arguably one of the reasons why Chavez was able to be in power for so long, because they tried to lead a coup against him.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's covered a lot of that.
Yeah, just have like a list of them, just check them all.
Yeah, and kind of like if you get to know the basic history of countries, particularly like unstable countries and their political history, it's really, really useful to know why countries are the way they are now and how they relate to other countries within a different region. Because as Scott said earlier, lots of countries which exist now didn't exist 100 years ago in the form that they do now. So like they were primarily carved out during like the period of colonial Britain. And you can see that by the fact they've got straight lines as their edges. They're not carved out along like the natural borderlines. And so like they often have like short and bloody histories, which are one, really interesting and horrible, and 2, also very, very useful for learning how to do IR.
Yeah, I mean, the Rwanda one's incredibly interesting, right, because those ethnicities were created by the Belgians, right? They literally made them up and used them as a way of ensuring that they had kind of an elite group in charge, able to suppress the rest of the country without necessarily like having to do it themselves. So looking at kind of
how the creation of power structures within countries is important can play out quite well in debate.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Cool.